Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for the second lesson of this unit about America's age of imperialism. In our first lesson, we talked about some of the reasons the United States became an imperial power. But today, we're going to talk about the most important event of this time, the Spanish-American War. Before we dive into the details, let's get a quick preview of the topics we'll be covering. The Spanish-American War was actually fought because of Cuba, so we'll be talking about where that country is, and how it led the United States and Spain into a war. Part of that story involves the Yellow Press, which you may remember from our last unit, is a sensational style of newspaper writing that was popular in the Gilded Age. The USS Maine was a battleship that was also wrapped up in those events. We'll talk about a law called the Teller Amendment, and how that law affected the outcome of the war. Of course, we'll be describing the war itself, some of the key battles, and how it turned out. And in the end, we'll need to spend a little time talking about a second conflict that America found itself in as a direct result of the Spanish-American War, a fight in the Philippines. Let's get started where it all began, Cuba. America and Cuba are two separate countries, but the connection between them goes back long before the imperialist era. Even before the Civil War, Southern planters had thought about making Cuba a part of the United States as a way of adding another slave state to the Union. In the end, this didn't happen, and Cuba stayed a Spanish colony. But because Cuba is so close to Florida, many Americans were still thinking about it. Cubans were not happy about the idea of being annexed by the United States. But by the late 1800s, they really didn't want to be a colony of Spain. Most of the other countries in Central and South America had been independent for a long time. Revolts against the Spanish were becoming common. When slavery ended in 1886 in Cuba, former slaves joined with farmers and the workers in the cities to fight for change. Many rich Cubans lost their land, and the number of sugar mills went down. Only companies and the richest plantation owners stayed in business. It was during this time that Americans started to buy the sugar plantations in Cuba that were closing down. Although it was still a Spanish colony, the United States was becoming more and more important for Cuba's economy. In 1881, the Cuban leader Jose Marti moved to the United States to get away from the Spanish who wanted to put him in jail. In America, he worked with other Cubans to get the United States to help them win independence from Spain. He also worked to make sure the United States didn't try to annex Cuba, which some American leaders still wanted. Americans mostly wanted to help the Cubans in their fight for independence. The United States had gone through a similar fight with Great Britain a century before and felt like it was their chance to help someone else. The Cubans, led by Jose Marti, had done a good job of telling Americans about their problems. Sometimes the Cubans had even damaged American sugar mills and railroads in Cuba as a way to get Americans to get involved. The Cubans thought that if America got involved in their fight with Spain, it would probably be on the side of the Cubans who wanted independence. Spain did not have any plans to give Cuba its independence, and the Spanish government sent 50,000 soldiers to the island. The Spanish general, Valeriano Weyler, created concentration camps to hold Cuban fighters that he had caught, and overall made life very hard for the Cubans. Americans called Weyler Butcher Weyler, and his decisions made Americans even more eager to help the Cubans. As more and more Americans, and also American leaders, said that they should help Cubans, President McKinley said he would work with Spain for Cuban independence. Spain told him no, but did try to make some changes so that the Americans would not be so upset. After all, the Spanish leaders did not want a war with the United States, which was a growing world power. We need to take a moment here to step back and remind ourselves of a topic we talked about in our last unit. You may recall that during the Gilded Age, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were competing for newspaper readers by writing more and more exciting and sometimes fake stories. This style of newspaper writing is called yellow journalism, and it played a big part in the story of the Spanish-American War. Once, looking for a juicy story, Hearst sent a photographer to Cuba to take pictures of the war for his newspapers. But the photographer sent a telegram back that there was not any war. Hearst is said to have answered, You take care of the pictures, I'll take care of the war. Hearst printed a sensational drawing on the front page of his journal of an American woman being searched by Spanish officers. The story was fake, but it sold newspapers. Many historians today think that yellow journalism played a big part in getting Americans angry enough to go to war with Spain. As people in America were getting angry, President McKinley and General Weyler were both trying to cool things off to avoid a war. Just when it looked like a peaceful deal might be possible, bad luck struck. Fitzhugh Lee, the American government's representative in Havana, the capital of Cuba, thought it would be a good idea for the United States to make sure the Spanish knew how powerful the American Navy was. He asked the Navy to send the USS Maine, a battleship, to visit Havana Harbor. It was supposed to be a peaceful visit, but it was definitely America showing off its power. While the Maine was visiting Havana, a letter written by Spanish Ambassador Delhomme in the United States was stolen out of the mail by a Cuban revolutionary. He gave it to a reporter of the Hearst newspapers. The letter was full of insults about President McKinley, and Hearst printed the letter in the New York Journal. Americans were outraged, and Delhomme had to quit and go back to Spain. 1 week later, the Maine blew up, killing over 200 American sailors. The explosion was probably an accident, but we can never know for sure. Spain did not have any good reason to attack the Maine. After all, they were trying to stay out of a war with the United States. But Americans blamed them anyway. The yellow press started printing the slogan, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." But President McKinley still didn't think war with Spain was such a good idea, although it was clear that he wanted Spain out of Cuba, even so far as to offer to buy the island. He was not excited about war. Historians mostly agree, however, that the American people, angered by what they were reading in the yellow press, pushed the president to go to war. In the end, President McKinley, himself a veteran of the Civil War, asked Congress to declare war on Spain, and on April 25, 1898, the United States officially went to war with Spain. An amendment, or addition or change to a law known as the Teller Amendment, was added to Congress's declaration of war, saying that the United States was not fighting the war to take Cuba and make it an American colony. The splendid little war, as it was later called by Secretary of State John Hay, was easily won by the United States. Americans supported the war happily, and many young men volunteered. However, the regular army, which had done very little fighting, except fighting the Native Americans since the Civil War, was not prepared to manage the change from peace to war, and mobilization was slow, disorganized, and it was months before any American soldiers actually landed in Cuba. The Navy, on the other hand, was ready. Because of Mahan's book and leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, the government had just spent a lot of money building up the Navy. The Navy fought well from the beginning. Commodore George Dewey and his American ships beat the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in the Philippines. The United States Navy also beat the Spanish fleet off the coast of Cuba. However, moving ships between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans during the war showed Americans just how important it was to dig a canal in Central America. Although the army was disorganized, many men had signed up, including Theodore Roosevelt, who quit his job in government to lead the Rough Riders. American soldiers fought bravely and beat the Spanish army near Santiago in Cuba. Americans also took over Puerto Rico, another Caribbean island that was a Spanish colony. The fighting lasted less than 4 months. Less than 400 American soldiers died in the fighting, but more than 10 times as many died from sickness. The most popular picture of the Spanish-American War is of Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charging up San Juan Hill. One thing Americans often don't know is that the Rough Riders would not have done as well if they'd not been helped by more than 2,500 black soldiers who joined them in battle. These soldiers, who had been fighting in the Indian Wars for many years, were key to the victory in Cuba. The choice to serve in the Spanish-American War was not a simple one. Within the African-American community, many spoke out both for and against the war. Some felt that because they were not given equal rights, it was not their job to join the war. Others said that joining the army was a way for African Americans to show the rest of the country that they could be equal to white Americans. The army needed experienced soldiers and was happy to have African Americans join. But the black soldiers still had to deal with racism and were not treated well in the southern states they visited before leaving for Cuba. Once in Cuba, however, the smoked Yankees, as the Cubans called the African American soldiers, fought side by side with Roosevelt's Rough Riders. After the Battle of San Juan Hill, 5 African American soldiers were given the Medal of Honor, and 25 others were given awards as well. One reporter wrote that the Rough Riders could not have won without the help of the African Americans. For some of the soldiers, this made joining the army worthwhile. Others, however, felt more of a connection with the Afro-Puerto Ricans and Afro-Cubans than they did with the whites of their own country. As the war ended, Spanish and American leaders met for a peace conference in Paris. The Spanish wanted to keep the Philippines. They felt that the war had been about Cuban independence and it was wrong for the United States to take the Philippines. President McKinley did not want to give up the Philippines. For sure, he did not want to give the islands back to Spain, but he also was afraid that another European country might try to take over the Philippines if the Americans did not. Because of racist feelings about the Filipinos, the Spanish and Americans never even thought about giving the Filipinos independence. William Howard Taft was the first American Governor General to try to lead the new American colony, and his choice of words shows the way many Americans felt at that time. He called the Filipinos our little brown brothers. Filipino leader Emilio Aguinaldo did not like the idea of getting rid of the Spanish just to have the Americans take over instead. He and his followers had been fighting the Spanish for years, and after the United States took control of the Philippines, they switched to fighting the Americans. The result was the Philippine-American War, or the Filipino Insurrection. It was one of the ugliest wars in American history. The Filipinos' war for independence lasted 3 years, with over 4,000 Americans and 20,000 Filipino combatant deaths. Probably 250,000 people who were not soldiers also died during the war. Terrible crimes were committed by American soldiers against both Filipino soldiers and civilians. Upset that things weren't getting better, President McKinley decided that it would be better to have a civilian lead the American government in the Philippines, instead of putting the army generals in charge. Things got better under Governor William Taft. Americans built new roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools, hoping to show the Filipino people that things would be better if they stayed a colony of the United States. It started to work. More people accepted the American leadership, and Aguinaldo was captured by American soldiers and had to promise to follow American laws. Taft continued making changes that he hoped would make life better for regular Filipino people. He also gave jobs in the government to resistance leaders if they agreed to stop fighting against the Americans. The war ended July 2, 1902, with a win for the United States. However, some Filipino groups kept up their fight for independence. Among those leaders was General Masario Sakay, who had taken over as leader of the Filipino resistance after the capture of President Emilio Aguinaldo. Other groups include the Moro people and the Pulahanes people, continued to fight against the Americans for 10 more years. Being an American colony changed the Philippines. English became the main language of government, schools, and business. The Catholic Church lost its place as the official religion, although most Filipinos are still Catholic today. In 1916, Congress passed the Jones Act. This law promised that the United States would give the Philippines independence someday, and also gave Filipinos more control until that happened. Finally, in 1946, after World War II, the United States gave the Philippines full independence. Some Americans, including William Jennings Bryan, Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and members of the American Anti-Imperialist League, did not like the annexation of the Philippines. Anti-imperialists said that the United States had just taken over from Spain as the colonial ruler of the Philippines, and that having colonies was wrong. Other anti-imperialists had racist reasons for not liking annexation. Among these was Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina, who was afraid that annexation of the Philippines would mean more non-white immigrants would start coming to the United States. As people in the newspapers read about the terrible things that American soldiers were doing in the Philippines, fewer and fewer Americans liked the idea of fighting to keep control. President McKinley and Governor Taft decided to make deals with the Filipinos to end the war partly because they were losing support of their own people. Let's talk now about the long-term effect of the Spanish and Philippine-American Wars. The result of the Spanish-American War was the 1898 Treaty of Paris, which was good for the United States. The United States got several island territories. Spain gave the United States control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Puerto Rico and Guam are still American territories today, and the people of these territories are American citizens, although since they are not states, they have no representative in Congress and cannot vote for president. The wars are also the beginning of the United States being involved in world affairs. Before the Spanish-American War, the United States was mostly isolationist. Isolationism is when a country tries to keep to itself. Although Americans still disagree about how much we should be involved, since the Spanish-American War, the United States has been much more involved in world affairs. After the Spanish-American War, the United States had many years of business and population growth and technological innovation that lasted through the 1920s. The war changed the way Americans thought about their country, helped the country come together around a single goal, and also changed the way newspapers reported about big events. The war put an end to the Spanish Empire. Spain had once been the strongest country in the world, but had been losing power all through the 1800s. After the war, Spain lost all of its important colonies. Never again would Spain be among the world's most powerful nations. For a few years after the war, the Americans stayed in Cuba. Like Taft in the Philippines, General Leonard Wood led an effort to rebuild the Cuban government, roads, schools, and hospitals. American doctors Walter Reed and William Gorgas exterminated yellow fever in Cuba. As they had promised to do, the Americans left Cuba in 1902. However, Cuban independence was not total. Congress passed the Platt Amendment of 1903, which limited what the Cubans could do. First, it said that Cuba could not make treaties with other countries unless the United States approved them. The Cuban government could not borrow money if it could not pay it back. And most of all, the United States would be allowed to send the army back to Cuba if American leaders thought things were getting out of hand. And finally, the United States was allowed to build a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Even though the United States government and the Cuban governments don't get along today, the base at Guantanamo Bay is still under American control. Okay, let's close out by reviewing the big ideas from today's stories. The United States went to war with Spain in 1898 because of Cuba. Cubans wanted independence, and some people in the United States were sympathetic to the Cuban cause. Also, after reading sensational newspaper stories about terrible things the Spanish were doing in Cuba, many Americans wanted to help. The USS Maine, an American battleship, exploded while visiting Havana, Cuba. It is still unclear why the explosion happened, but Americans blamed the Spanish and demanded war. The Spanish-American War was an easy victory for the United States. The United States allowed Cuba to become independent, but passed a law saying that they would intervene if there were problems in Cuba. In this way, Cuba was always mostly, but not totally independent. As a result of the war, the United States took control of the Spanish territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Filipinos had also been fighting for independence when the war broke out. After the United States took over the Philippines, the Filipinos began fighting the Americans. In the end, the Filipinos agreed to a deal in which the Americans maintained control of their country, but allowed the Filipinos to make many of their own decisions. The United States kept the Philippines as a colony for about 50 years. Thank you very much. In our third and final lesson of this unit on imperialism, we'll be talking about the other countries in Latin America the United States was involved in, including Panama, Mexico, as well as describing the way we got involved in China. I'll see you then.